Allows the meat to relax and reabsorb its delicious juices, making sure it's tender and succulent. Nice and gently. Hear that pastry, how crisp that is. This is the bit we've been waiting for. Oh wow. My God. If you want a...
Welcome to episode 2 of the Tenderloing series, and in this episode, let's make that. This is actually my first time making a beef Wellington, so this video will be more about documenting my journey and what went wrong, because I certainly made quite a few mistakes. So starting off, I'm making my own puff pastry. I've made this before and it's actually like so much better than the store-bought one. Here I'm following a recipe straight from Joshua Weissman's video, go check it out. Puff pastry takes a while to make, so I started early in the morning. The way puff pastry works is that it separates a layer of dough with butter. This is achieved by folding a laminated piece of butter and dough many times to exponentially increase the layer of lamination each time. I kneaded the dough until it's one cohesive mass, then placed it on top of a piece of parchment paper. Using a tape measure, I folded the parchment paper around the dough, forming a perfect square, then rolled out the dough to fit the shape of the square parchment paper. For the exact process and measurements, go check out Joshua Weissman's video on puff pastry, it's really good. Once it's rolled out, I sent it into the fridge to cool. The key thing in making puff pastry is that the butter doesn't melt, so everything must be as cold as possible. I then used a similar method to form a square piece of butter. To help the butter stay firm, I chose one that is higher in fat content. To better form a square, I first cubed the butter, then smashed them together with a rolling pin. After that, it's a similar process as rolling out the dough, but instead forming a square that's smaller than the dough so it can be wrapped within. The butter needs to cool down again after getting handled on the counter, so I popped it back into the fridge for about 30 minutes. Once both the dough and butter was cooled down, it was time to fold them together. I started by placing the butter in the center of the dough diagonally, then folding the corners of the dough onto the butter and sealing the seams. Afterwards, the entire thing is folded in thirds, creating the first lamination. This fold is repeated 6 times with about 30 minutes of rest in the fridge in between each fold to keep the temperature of the butter low so that it doesn't melt into the dough. By the time I was done, it was already nighttime, so I left the puff pastry in the fridge overnight to firm up before rolling out the final fold the next day. Day 2 is when the Wellington is actually made. In my previous episode of this Tenderloing series, I trimmed the entire piece of tenderloin into several pieces. For the Wellington, we'll be using the center cut, aka the Chateaubriand cut. We'll be searing this piece of beef, so I'm heating up a cast iron skillet on the stove over medium-high heat. To get a good sear on the meat, I patted the tenderloin as dry as possible with a paper towel so that the outer surface can get a good crust on the stove. I also heavily seasoned it with salt and pepper, rolling it around so all surfaces are coated with seasoning. Right after I'm done searing it, I'm going to coat it with a layer of Dijon mustard, so I'm preparing that as well. Onto the ripping hot skillet goes a healthy dose of grapeseed oil and carefully dropping in the tenderloin. This was the sound it made. I slowly turned the tenderloin so that all sides are seared, not forgetting the 2 ends as well. I'm only looking to sear the meat and not to cook it fully, so right after a crust is developed, I took it off of the heat. As the tenderloin was still warm, I brushed every single surface with Dijon mustard and left it aside to cool. Now it's time to prepare the mushroom duxelle. A duxelle is basically a paste made from finely chopped mushrooms and shallots. For this, I'll be using my food processor. There are actually a few purposes to this paste. It'll serve to add flavor to the Wellington, but more importantly, it insulates and absorbs the moisture from the beef inside. The temperature needed to bring a piece of beef to medium rare is much lower than what it takes to bake pastry. So the inside of the Wellington needs to remain much cooler than the outer surface. This layer of mushroom duxelle acts as an insulator to keep the core cool. When a piece of beef is cooked, there's also a lot of moisture released. If that moisture goes into the pastry, then the pastry will become soggy and disgusting. So this insulating layer is also there to soak up any moisture released from the meat. I washed and chopped about 8 ounces of baby bella mushrooms and 1 shallot, but this was when stuff kinda started to go wrong, but more on that later. A few pulses on a food processor and a sprinkling of nutmeg later, the mushroom and shallot was turned into a wet paste that needs to be cooked to release all the moisture within. Remember that this layer of duxelle needs to absorb the moisture from the beef, so it needs to be as dry as possible to begin with. For this drying process, I swapped out my cast iron skillet for a non-stick pan because mushroom sticks very easily and will burn. I dumped the duxelle into the pan cold, spread it out, and just let it cook over medium heat and turning it over once in a while. It'll kind of bubble like as if it's a soup or something, but that's just the moisture going away. Now this is when I realized that I didn't have anywhere close to enough mushrooms to make the duxelle. Mushrooms are like 80% water, so they'll shrink a ton once the moisture is cooked off, and even the amount that's in the pan right now isn't enough to cover the entire tenderloin. So I had to make a trip to the store. This was the amount of duxelle left after evaporating most of the moisture. As you can see, it really wasn't a lot. I poured it out onto a piece of paper towel and patted it dry as much as I can before heading out to get more mushrooms. Now I was actually quite hesitant about doing this because, you know, it's 2020 and there's something called coronavirus. But with all that I've put into this already, I decided to mask up and risk my life to go get another box of mushrooms. I then basically did the same thing, but this time with a 16-ounce box of mushrooms. Food processing it, cooking it, and drying it. And then I don't know if it's because I was slightly stressed out because of the mushroom situation, or just that I was being really dumb, but I forgot to record this next part of wrapping everything in prosciutto. So I'm just gonna show how Gordon Ramsay did it.
These wonderful slices of Parma ham, and look, beautiful. Overlap it and set it there. So the secret of overlapping the Parma ham is to make sure it contains all those juices coming out of the beef. And then from there, your mushrooms. And basically, mushrooms go on. Use the back of the spoon to spread them nice and thinly. Half an inch from the ends. We're gonna lift that up and wrap the beef nice and carefully. So all that mushroom and Parma ham is encasing the beef all the way over. Just nip it at the ends and squeeze. And what we're doing is just creating this wonderful sort of cylinder shape off, and then just twist it nice and tightly.
Once again, I'm so sorry for making this such a dumb mistake. But moving on, with the prosciutto wrapped tenderloin chilling in the fridge, I went ahead and brought out the puff pastry I made yesterday and rolled it out to a thin sheet about 3/8 of an inch thick. Here you can see me bringing out the wrapped tenderloin that I forgot to film, and I'm placing it in the center of the puff pastry and carefully wrapping the pastry over the tenderloin, rolling it over, trimming off some excess, and then carefully tucking in the sides and doing a final trimming. I was now at the final stretch. With the oven heated and ready to go, I placed the Wellington onto a baking sheet and brushed it generously with an egg wash. Then, taking my knife to carefully score some diagonal lines across the pastry, which should look really cool once it's baked. With a thermometer inserted into the deepest part of the beef, into the oven goes. While the Wellington is baking in the oven, I made a quick pepper cream sauce, which is basically just beef stock, cream, and a ton of pepper. Once the thermometer hit 125 degrees, I took the Wellington out of the oven. The outer puff pastry has reached a very nice dark brown color. I'm going to let the Wellington rest for a few minutes, which is going to let the beef relax and come up a few degrees before it is ready to be carved in. That was my first attempt on beef Wellington. I think overall it turned out really well, but there also could be a lot of improvements to be made. You know, beef Wellington is not something that I can like just master in one try. That's why I didn't format this video like how I format normal videos. In the future, I'm planning on making this more and maybe posting an updated version of this video on how I've improved over time, because this is honestly one of the dishes that I really enjoy to make and I really want to perfect it. If you've enjoyed this video, consider hitting the like button and subscribing. Comment down below what you want to see on this channel next. But on that note, I'll see you guys very soon in the next video.